Good afternoon. Thank you for joining the Dole Institute of Politics for the program this afternoon. My name is Michael Scott, and I'm a member of the Institute's Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. The SAB is a bipartisan group. As a member of the SAB, I get access to many great opportunities by being involved with the Institute. If you are a KU student and are interested in joining, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu. For this afternoon's event, if you would like to know more about our guest, the event itself, upcoming Institute events, and more, you can download a printable program handout. The link is in the event description below. At the end of this afternoon's event, we will have time for you to ask questions of our guests. Please email your questions to dolequestions@ku.edu. And now, please join me in welcoming Associate Director and Director of Archives and the Museum, Audrey Coleman.
Thank you, Michael, for that warm welcome. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for what is our third installment of our afternoon program series inspired by our current exhibit, Voices from the Big First, 1961 to 1968. This exhibit was curated by Kansas historian Virgil Dean and was made possible by Humanities Kansas. You might remember back in February, we chatted with Dr. Dean in the first installment of this series about the development of the Voices exhibit, which features constituent letters to Congressman Dole during the 1960s. Last month, we visited with Frances Graves and Trista Brown, two women who are leaders here in Kansas today in agriculture and community development. This afternoon, though, I am so excited that we're visiting with Dr. Robert Weems, who is the Willard Garvey Distinguished Professor of Business History at Wichita State University. We'll be taking a look outside the Big First at Wichita's Black business leaders during the 1960s and the national policies that were intended to support them. Dr. Weems, I'm so pleased you could be with us this afternoon. Thank you so much for your time. So please tell me a little bit about your path to Kansas, to Wichita State, about your field of study, and what are some of the projects that you've undertaken in past years that have highlighted the Black business community in Wichita?
Yeah, in fact, in terms of my path to Kansas and Wichita, as was stated in the introduction, I was born and raised in Chicago. And when it was time for me to choose a dissertation topic, it came down to wanting to do something, and I wanted to do something on the history of Black Chicago. And it came down to either choosing a topic related to the business history of that community or the political history. And I think literally one of the best professional decisions I made, I chose to focus on the business history of that community. My Ph.D. dissertation and first book was on a local African-American insurance company. And that led me into, interesting enough, in looking at that company and other African-American insurance companies, I noticed that in the 1950s and 60s, they came under increasing competitive pressure from larger mainstream companies, which earlier had pretty much ignored Black consumers as potential clients. And that, opened the door for the establishment of Black insurance companies. And when I saw this going on in the insurance industry, a light went out in my head. Well, check out other sectors of the economy. And I saw where, in fact, that during the 1950s and 60s, there was an increased interest in what was then called the Negro market. And that led ultimately to my second book, Desegregating the Dollar, which is an examination of African-American consumerism in the 20th century. And in terms of my intellectual path and tied into our comments today, is that being a child of the 60s, I've always had an interest in that period and sort of the Black freedom movement during that period, and how specifically, the Black Power movement had a business component to it. And that sort of long-standing interest, contributed to my third book, Business in Black and White, which looked at American presidents and Black entrepreneurs in the 20th century. And I mentioned, Chicago has been one of the cornerstones of my research interests. 2017, I co-edited a book on, African-American entrepreneurship in Chicago. And in fact, this last spring, March of 2020, I published a biography of Anthony Overton, who was one of the leading entrepreneurial figures in Black Chicago in the early 20th century. Now, my direct path to WSU is kind of interesting, and in that I first found out about the Garvey Distinguished Professor position based upon writing a letter of recommendation for a colleague who applied for that position. And in a strange twist of fate, if you will, this individual turned out to be, the leading candidate, but he wasn't able to take the job. There were some family complications that didn't permit him to take the job. And again, he was their top candidate, and they asked him, can you recommend someone for this position? And he recommended me. And this is really fate, if you will, on one level, in that, my Kansas connection, predates me teaching at Wichita State. My father grew up in Kansas. I still have relatives in Kansas City, Kansas. And during my childhood and young adult life, I would, go back and forth to Kansas. So Kansas is, Wichita State was not my first, exposure to the state of Kansas. The answer to your question, but I did want to get that latter part in there.
Well, you have, and I'm part of in recent years, and part of what I read in preparation for the interview were some oral history. So you've undergone oral history collecting program, and also spearheaded a project with the Chamber of Commerce in Wichita.
Yes. One of the things when I came to Wichita State in 2011 was to, in fact, start a project that would, spotlight local African-American entrepreneurship. Because one of the things I've found during the course of my career is that, African-American business history remains one of the most understudied areas of the African-American experience. And being in Wichita gave me the opportunity to conduct what I call the African-American Business History Project, where I interviewed a wide variety of local African-American entrepreneurs. And ultimately, I donated the transcripts and the audio interviews themselves to the Wichita State University Library. So they will remain a source of information for people that are interested in this subject matter. And on a very basic level, for me, it was an opportunity to really document forever, this part of local Wichita history.
So for our discussion today, we're focusing on the 60s. Can you tell us about, a little bit more about the background of the Black community in Wichita at the time? How large was it? How many were business leaders? What types of businesses did they own? And was this similar, or how does that compare to other cities of similar size at the time?
Yeah, Wichita by the 1960s had really undergone, Black Wichita in particular, had really undergone dramatic growth. In 1950, there were a little more than 8,000 African Americans in Wichita. By 1960, that number had grown to almost 20,000. So the Black population had more than doubled. One of the consequences of this, enhanced African American population in Wichita was a growth of the local African American business community. Before the 1960s, probably the main business strip of the local African-American community was the 9th Street Business District. But by the 1960s, when you had, again, more and more African-Americans, we saw the 13th Street Business District expand. That included a wide variety of African-American enterprises, but similar to a lot of African-American enterprises in other cities, most of the enterprises that were present during the 1960s tended to be, provide personal services to their clients, places such as restaurants, barber shops, beauty shops, cleaners, tailors, and the like.
Would you tell us a little bit about Jackson Mortuary, which was not just a business that provided these services in the community, but also, played a much larger role in supporting folks all across the area. Can you tell us a little bit about Jackson Mortuary?
Yeah, Jackson Mortuary is really an important enterprise. Among other things, it represents a true legacy business, because one of the issues with African-American businesses historically is that when the owner of the founder dies, the business tends not to survive. But, Jackson Mortuary is literally in its 4th generation. It started in 1926. And besides, providing, funeral and burial services to local African Americans, at some point in time, Jackson Mortuary served as a sort of unofficial bank to prospective, Black business startups in Wichita. And also Jackson Mortuary oftentimes, gave discounted funerals to people in the African-American community as part of its sort of service mission. But when we look at, Jackson Mortuary as a business enterprise for really from the 20s well through the 20th century, Jackson Mortuary really was one of the largest enterprises here in Wichita. And because of their profitability, again, they were able to, engage in such things, again, as providing, startup capital to prospective Black business persons and offering, discounted funerals.
Yeah. One of the themes that I noticed in the oral history interviews that you conducted was this access to capital, the problem of getting financing for folks who were interested in trying to start their own business. In addition to going to places like Jackson Mortuary, which had the community role, what did some of Wichita's Black business leaders do to try to start their own banks or credit unions? And can you tell us about their experience doing that?
Well, that's a great question, in that one of the things that came through in a lot of the interviews that I did was that when we look at the mid 20th century in Wichita, it wasn't the most hospitable place for African-American entrepreneurship. So a lot of individuals, to grow their businesses, literally had to go outside of the city, to establish branches in other parts of the country to, in fact, expand their enterprise. There was an attempt to start a Black bank in Wichita in the 1970s and a credit union in the 1980s. These, unfortunately, were relatively short-lived. And in my own thoughts about why these, banks and credit unions really were not able to, say, flourish in a Wichita, was based upon the fact that the Black population is still relatively small here, even though, again, as I mentioned in the beginning, that the Black population more than doubled from between 1950 and 1960. Even moving later in the 20th century, Wichita's African-American population remained, relatively small, and couldn't, really, support a bank or a credit union. And again, we also have to keep in mind too that even after de jure segregation ended with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, a lot of de facto segregation still was present here in Wichita and in fact across the country. And we saw a lot of, white consumers not necessarily interested in, patronizing, an African-American owned credit union or an African-American controlled bank. So again, if these institutions had to rely, solely on a relatively, small, client base, again, I think that contributes to why, these types of institutions were never really able to take hold here in Wichita.
Mm-hmm. And so if you're an entrepreneur looking for financing, you would go through more informal means, finding someone who just was already an established leader and, creating your own sort of agreement with someone else who might be your neighbor or someone else.
And one thing too, that's important in looking at, access to capital, the SBA played a significant role in helping to underwrite a lot of African-American entrepreneurship, here in Wichita and across the country. And there were several individuals that I spoke to that said that the SBA was, very instrumental in terms of helping them to grow their businesses. But before the SBA programs that really began to target African-American entrepreneurs really began to kick in the 1970s. Again, before that, we saw people having to, rely upon other sources of potential capital to grow or start their businesses.
You and other scholars, when you're talking about Black business community and types of Black businesses, there's this characterization between a quote unquote traditional and a non-traditional Black business. What is the difference? Is it substantive or help us understand what the difference is? And can you give us some further examples from the Black community in Wichita from either type?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because when we talk about sort of the traditional enterprises in African-American communities, not just in Wichita, but across the country, we're talking about enterprises that focused on, providing personal services to other African-Americans, places like restaurants, beauty shops, and the like. But increasingly, by the 1960s, we saw a number of so-called non-traditional businesses that African Americans were engaged in. And in Wichita, you had some very noticeable and very important instances of non-traditional African American enterprises. One of the more significant ones was established by UL Rip Gooch, who, before he entered into a very prominent political career, was also an important local African-American entrepreneur. He, beginning in the late 50s and into the 1960s and 70s, he established a company called Aeroservices Inc, which was a fixed base operations aviation business, where he provided a number of services to airlines and in the aviation industry. Another significant non-traditional business was one owned by an individual named Robert Alford. Mr. Alford owned a business called Alford Electric. And this was one of the few Black-owned lighting showrooms in the entire US. And again, this was here in Wichita. Another non-traditional business was Charles Mcafee was and still is a prominent architect. And in the 1960s, we saw Mr. Mcafee start his architectural firm. And as time went on, and I mentioned that whole phenomenon of people going outside of Wichita to expand their business. Once two of Mr. Mcafee's daughters became architects as well, He established, not headquarters, but branches in Oklahoma City, Dallas, and in Atlanta. And one of the more truly interesting non-traditional African-American enterprises in Wichita during the 1960s was established by Henry Wolford, who set up an oil drilling business. And Wolford was one of the few African-Americans who owned an oil drilling business in the United States. So again, there was a clear difference between, again, those sort of traditional businesses that provided, personal services almost exclusively to other African Americans, and these non-traditional businesses that had a much broader client base.
Would you say that there is a relationship, or what is the relationship between level of education and the traditional business versus the non-traditional, or just in Black entrepreneurialism in general?
Yeah, that's an important question. When we look at some of the early African-American entrepreneurs, say people that were starting, restaurants and barbershops and what have you, one didn't necessarily need to have a college degree or a professional degree to engage in those types of enterprises. Increasingly, as we move into the later part of the 20th century, we saw more and more African Americans, for instance, getting business degrees, because for a variety of reasons, most African Americans who had degrees got those degrees in the realm of education, because teaching was one of those areas that African Americans could get professional jobs. But increasingly, by we get into the 70s, 80s, 90s, and into a new millennium, as more and more African Americans, went to business school, got BAs in business and MBAs. Again, we've seen a significant increase in the number of quote unquote non-traditional businesses. But this isn't to say that you still do have a good cadre of sort of the traditional business, the barbershops, the restaurants, the beauty shops, and the like.
In the exhibit here at the Institute, we have a letter from Kansas State Senator Curtis McClinton, who was the first Black state senator here in Kansas, and also from Wichita. And he was writing to Congressman Dole in support of the Fair Housing Act, or the Civil Rights Act of 1966, which didn't pass Congress, but was revised and then finally passed in 1968 as the Fair Housing Act. And McClinton, as I understand it, he was a proprietor of McClinton's Market and also a realtor. Did segregation, you mentioned before, so this fight for segregation or desegregation, pardon me, he was pushing for that in the state legislature in the House in the 1950s. You mentioned desegregation as actually complicating things, or maybe working in a pejorative sense against the Black business community. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, in a very real sense, when we look at sort of economic desegregation or integration, we saw pretty much a one-way movement. We saw, white businesses gaining, greater access to African-American clients. And we saw African-American enterprises a lot of times really not being able to expand outside of their traditional, African-American, clientele. And I mentioned earlier that I really began my research in this area and looking at Black insurance companies. That's really a classic case study in this regard, whereby beginning in the 1950s, we saw larger companies like Prudential and Metropolitan Life, and how I characterize take advantage or profit from past discrimination by marketing equitable policies to African Americans, and it literally became a status symbol in the African American community to say that I have the same policy that Prudential is selling to their white clients, and in order to do this, Prudential and Metropolitan Life, in fact, recruited the top agents from Black insurance companies to come sell for them. Now, from the standpoint of Black insurers, they came from the mindset, well, turnabout is fair play. So if they're going to hire, Black agents to sell their products, let us hire and train white agents to sell our products. And indeed, we saw a lot of Black insurance companies that, hired and trained white agents to sell their products in the white community. But unfortunately for these Black companies, when these white agents went into, white consumers' homes and started talking about the company, and when white consumers figured out that, okay, even though this is a white agent, it looked like he's representing a Black company, white consumers weren't that enthusiastic about doing business. So in the end, one of the consequences of this, and just looking at the Black insurance industry as an example, is that today, Black insurance companies are pretty much all but extinct, because again, they could not move outside of their traditional Black clientele. But over time, they had increased competition from majority white companies. So again, you have segregation or integration or desegregation from an economic standpoint is a bit complicated and nuanced.
Before we shift gears here really quickly, I want to invite the virtual audience. Remember, you can submit questions to dolequestions@ku.edu. Send us in a question for Dr. Weems, and we'll get to that in just a few minutes. dolequestions@ku.edu. I wanted to switch gears, Dr. Weems, and you mentioned earlier the SBA small business programs that the government provided. Historically, President Nixon has been given credit for promoting Black capitalism. And I wanted to ask you why that was and what he did.
Yeah, when we look at the presidential election of 1968, which is really one of the pivotal elections in American history, quite frankly, we saw both the Republican candidates as well as the Democratic candidates in the primary and in the general election that were promoting this notion of Black capitalism or trying to enhance African-American, business development. By the late 1960s, a variety of surveys, clearly indicated that, in the African-American community, there was an increased interest in, business activity and programs to promote African-American business ownership. Now, all that being said, when we look at 1968, even though all the candidates promoted some form of Black capitalism, because Richard Nixon won that election, again, that's one of the reasons why he is more associated with Black capitalism, say, versus, Hubert Humphrey or Bobby Kennedy. And one of the things that Nixon did, shortly after becoming president and keeping this particular campaign promise was his establishment of the Office of Minority Business Enterprise. And even though, the Office of Minority Business Enterprise got off to a relatively rocky start because, funding issues and what have you, within a couple of years, the Office of Minority Business Enterprise was able to, catch a stride to a certain extent. And we do see some significant accomplishments associated with this governmental agency that was part of the Nixon administration. There was a significant increase in the number of African Americans that owned franchises. The number of Black-owned banks increased significantly. The number of African American owned car dealerships. And looking at Nixon and Black capitalism, there's, to me, as a historian, an intriguing what if associated with Nixon's promotion of Black business. And that what if involves Watergate. At the time when Nixon, started off Minority Business Enterprise, it was housed in the Commerce Department. And the Secretary of Commerce at the time was Maurice Stans. And Stans was a strong proponent of trying to get this Office of Minority Business Enterprise off the ground. But we know that in 1972, Stans left the Commerce Department to become, the head of Nixon's reelection campaign. And with Stans off the scene, and then we know the other ramifications of Watergate, one of the what ifs is, what if Watergate hadn't happened? And if, Office Minority Business Enterprise was able to really, progress even more. Because another important point related to that when Nixon resigned from office, Gerald Ford, in fact, continued, the Office Minority Business Enterprise. When Jimmy Carter was elected in 1976, he, in fact, enhanced some of the programs to promote Black business. But again, Richard Nixon, because he won that 68 election, and because one of the issues related to issues that was promoted in that election was the question of enhancing Black business development, Nixon again gets a lot of credit, for that.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that, by 1968, Black business development was on the agenda of both parties. So looking back to the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, who were some of the leaders in those administrations that were promoting Black business development, and what were they do? What were some of their proposed solutions?
Eugene P. Foley, who was the administrator of the Small Business Administration from 1963 to 1965, was a very strong advocate for African American business development. During the first 10 years of its existence, the Small Business Administration had a negligible interest in Black entrepreneurship. When Foley was administrator of the SBA, he made, the promotion of Black business a special priority of the SBA, and was instrumental in setting up various loan programs. In the Commerce Department, there was an individual by the name of Abraham Venable. And Venable, in fact, was an early promoter of African Americans owning franchises. Because when we look at franchise as a business model, it's excellent for people that have, limited business background. It's literally a business in a box. All you have to do is pretty much follow directions. And Venable saw this as a means to really help jumpstart Black business development. Also, Venable came up with a very innovative program that he called the Athlete Project, where essentially he, in consortium with the NFL, established a program where all of the, at the time, there were 136 Black players in the NFL, and they all donated money to a pool. And literally the money that accumulated in this pool was used to, in fact, engage in various franchise opportunities. Because Venable had this notion that because of the visibility of African American athletes who are role models in sort of athletic endeavors, he also saw this as an opportunity for these athletes to become role models in a business sense. And finally, we look at government officials during the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. One of the more important ones was Howard J. Samuels, who by 1968, he had succeeded Eugene P. Foley as the administrator of the SBA. And Samuels came up with a project called Project Own. And Project Own sought to dramatically increase the number of Black-owned retail establishments in the United States. And one of the motivations for this was when we look at the urban disorders that took place across America in 1967, among the targets in Black neighborhoods were Black-owned businesses. And there was this belief that African Americans would be less inclined to, destroy a Black-owned business in their community. And one of the very important things about Project to enter into an agreement with the American Bankers Association, where they in fact agreed to provide funding for prospective African American, retail business owners from the late 60s into the 70s, because Howard, Samuels in fact envisioned that by, dramatically increasing the number of Black-owned enterprises in the United States, that, he envisioned by 1980 sort of the entrepreneurial gap between whites and Blacks would be significantly decreased. And again, what I would consider to be, an intriguing historical what if. What if, Hubert Humphrey had in fact won the presidential election of 1968 and in fact had allowed Howard J. Samuels' Project OWN to really take hold and be implemented. How might that have changed, the landscape of American business in subsequent years?
During the course of your interviews and your conversations with Wichita's Black business leaders, did you find, did they acknowledge, did they feel like there was evidence that the federal policies, these programs were helping them in real time during the decade of the 60s? Does that take time to become successful, or were these programs that they were proposing, did they do what they were intended to do for folks who were trying to make it at the time?
Yeah, when we look at the local scene, and especially looking at the state level, Kansas, in fact, started its own Office of Minority Business Enterprise, pretty much modeled after the federal organization. And there were, people, Black business leaders in Wichita that were a part of the Kansas Office Minority Business Enterprise. And as I mentioned earlier, you had a lot of local entrepreneurs that were able to, in fact, grow their businesses based upon the SBA's enhanced commitment to serve the needs of African American entrepreneurs.
How did promoting Black business development in the 60s, what was that relationship to the civil rights movement?
Going back to Eugene P. Foley for a moment, to answer this question. Mm-hmm. In 1961, there was a White House conference on business, on African American business in particular. And people, gave a variety of papers on the state of Black business at the time. And Eugene P. Foley, even before he became administrator of the SBA, in his remarks, he said something to the effect that while, the focus on, public accommodations, enhanced public accommodation for African Americans is justifiably an important part of this evolving civil rights movement, he also stated that, enhanced business opportunities, necessarily had to be a part of this because that would fully ensure that, African Americans would have, full citizenship, if you will. And with that mindset, when he became administrator of the SBA, he pretty much sought to do that. And as we move later into the decade, this whole notion that, real Black freedom would consist of more of just, being able to go to any restaurant or any hotel or what have, but also having enhanced opportunity to own a business, that would really, in fact, enhance African-American civil rights.
In general, and not just in the middle of the 20th century, but in your studies, what is the relationship between the party affiliation of the presidential administration to their interest in developing policies for Black business development?
Yeah, that's one of the more fascinating things that I have found in my research, is that historically, when we look at government programs to promote African-American entrepreneurship, they're one of the few things that have received, real bipartisan support. Both Republicans and Democrats have supported these initiatives. In fact, when we look at the African-American community, one of the things that, Black Republicans and Black Democrats can agree on is the fact that enhanced, business development is a good thing. So again, one of the more important aspects of this is that, both Democrats and Republicans have in fact promoted the importance of enhanced Black business development.
I have one more question before we go to questions that have been submitted from our virtual audience. So if you have a question, now's a good time to send it in to dolequestions@ku.edu. Dr. Weems, in the oral history interviews that you administered, you quoted the Reverend Wanda McDaniels, who said in 2001 that integration wasn't as good as everybody thought it was. Urban renewal took out a lot of businesses that were never replaced. 50 years ago, we had more legislators, more businesses, everything. And she's saying this 20 years ago. And this was a quote that you pulled out and put to your interviewees. So it's been 20 years since Reverend McDaniels, made this statement. What would you say in the ensuing 20 years? Has there been any change or improvement, or can you comment on the state of Black business today?
There has been, and again, just speaking in Wichita in particular, I think one of the reference points in Reverend McDaniel's comments was that the building of Interstate I-135 here in Wichita literally went right between the pre-existing African-American community. And a lot of African-American homes and a lot of African-American businesses had been displaced in that process. And some of those, in fact, never really recovered. But in looking at right now, in recent years, there has been, I think, a variety of important strides to, in fact, really enhance or really rebuild the local African-American business community. In fact, one of the organizations that I'm involved with is the Heartland Wichita Black Chamber of Commerce. During my speaking with several individuals since I've been here, there have been attempts to really get an African-American Chamber of Commerce off the ground and sustain itself. And this one, and I'm knocking on wood as I say this, then its fifth going on 6th year appears as if it's going to sustain itself. And one of the initiatives to really sort of connect past with present and to really hopefully get people excited about local African-American entrepreneurship is that through my affiliation with the Heartland Wichita Black Chamber of Commerce, I'm on their board of directors, that we've started a Wichita Black Business Hall of Fame. And there's been obviously COVID upset our more recent annual awards program, but the awards program sought to spotlight historic as well as current individuals who have distinguished themselves in the realm of business, and that, and as well as a lot of other initiatives, I think are really rekindling the important spirit of entrepreneurship, in this city and I think nationally. I guess my only concern when we talk about contemporary African American business is that we know because of COVID-19, a lot of small businesses in general have really taken a hit. And because African American business proportionally are more represented in the realm of small business, we saw African American enterprises being especially affected by COVID-19. And it's my hope that when the dust settles from all of this, is that the continuing African American business community will be able to grow and expand.
I have my first question from our virtual audience. This question is from Virgil. He asks, could you say more about how increased racial tension and unrest during the mid and late 1960s impacted African American businesses in Wichita and elsewhere?
Well, yeah, in 1967, the proverbial, what's been called the long hot summer. You had disturbances in over 150 cities across the country. A lot of this anger was directed at, ongoing de facto discrimination, even after the passage of, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And one of the targets, again, in these expressions of Black rage, were white-owned businesses in Black communities. And again, just one of the realities, even of Jim Crow segregation, was that Black businesses never had a monopoly on businesses in their community. At some points, it got as high as about 40%, but there never was, a monopoly of African American owned enterprises in Black communities. And in 1967, you had African Americans especially angry about a lot of these white owned enterprises that were in the Black community, making profits, but not really recycling those profits within the community. Some of these enterprises, even in the 60s, did not hire community residents. So in the aftermath of this, there was a real belief that by enhancing, the number of Black owned enterprises in Black communities across the country, that among other things, this would help to quell urban unrest. Because again, when we look at 1967, just the extent of racial unrest across the country was pretty dramatic. North, south, east, and west. And Wichita, in fact, was one of the places that experienced racial unrest in 1967 as well.
What are some examples of Black women entrepreneurs or business owners in Wichita?
Yeah, one of the classic ones is Xavier Hightower Howard. She, in fact, was one of her important business accolades was that she was the first African-American woman in the state of Kansas to get a dual license as a funeral director and as an embalmer. And from 1942 to 1998, she headed the Citizens Funeral Home here in Wichita, which was a competitor to Jackson Mortuary that we talked about earlier. And it's very interesting when we look at Xavier Hightower, in that, her mother, Victoria Hightower, was a pioneering Black entrepreneur in her own right. Her mother, Victoria Hightower, established a funeral home in Coffeyville, Kansas, and later established the Citizen, and later bought Citizen, because Citizen's Funeral Home was a pre-existing funeral home in Wichita. Victoria Hightower, bought that. And in fact, when Victoria Hightower died in 1942, Xavier Hightower again was able to come in and take over the company. And Xavier Hightower is a very interesting case study when we talk about African American female entrepreneurship, in that she operated in a industry that was and still is dominated by males. But her sort of rule of thumb in terms of how she was able to carve out a niche by being a woman in a male-dominated industry was that she, believed that she really had to really offer very strong service to her client base.
We have another question. We can get Dr. Weems's video back. Can you hear us, Dr. Weems?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, you can hear us via disembodied voice, at least for the time being.
Okay.
I have a question from Mark from the virtual audience. Can you talk about the early African-American journalists and Kansas newspapers in the 1960s? What level of involvement did they have in helping businesses succeed?
Yeah, when we look at, African-American newspapers, here in Wichita and literally across the country, they provided an important advertising for local African-American enterprises. And indeed, without, these advertising venues, things would have been that much more difficult in terms of, African-American enterprises, getting the word out about, the goods and services that they offered. So yeah, there was a literal symbiotic relationship between, African-American newspapers and the African-American business community, because we know newspapers are enterprises as well. And the advertising revenue they got from local African-American enterprises that, advertised in their periodicals was, again, it was a win-win, for both parties involved.
Another question that I have, what is the role of, in the 1960s, we're talking about Black business development in the context of the Cold War, just international, geopolitics, are there any influences there that encourage presidential administrations to promote Black businesses?
Great question. An interesting twist to that particular question. I mentioned earlier the 1961 conference on Negro business at the White House. And one of the papers at this conference made the point that looking at the American consumer market, and as I alluded to earlier, white businesses were, becoming increasingly interested in Black consumers as potential clients. And that was more and more competition that Black businesses had to face in this realm. But this particular paper argued that one of the ways in which Black businesses could expand was to, in fact, expand their enterprises on the African continent. Because among other things, at a time when both the Soviet Union and the United States were both seeking, client states on the African continent, there was a belief, and again, there was a quote that just came me from this paper that said, who could be a better salesman for American democracy in Africa than a Black business person with a good product or service to sell? Later on, when we get to the urban disorders of the 1960s, again, there was this belief that if we get more and more, African Americans, looking at business and capitalism as a positive, that would in fact, be helpful in terms of American foreign policy. Because again, we talk about, sort of the discourse that was going on in the 60s and 70s. You had some African Americans, possess a Marxist perspective that, were not that enthusiastic about, this promotion of Black business, if you will, from clearly based upon their orientation. So again, there was this notion that, as more and more, African Americans could see business as a positive, again, that could be something else that could be useful in terms of American foreign policy, where the United States could point to, yes, look at these business enterprises that are owned by African Americans, which,
Okay, I have two more questions before we close for the afternoon. This question is from Michael. This is talking about, he says, what are the similarities and differences between the history of Black entrepreneurship in Kansas, let's say Wichita and Chicago?
One of the major differences is population. As early as 1920, there were more than 100,000 African Americans in Chicago. And in that setting, we saw local African Americans being able to establish enterprises such as banks and insurance companies. And there would be a constituency large enough to ensure that these types of enterprises could be profitable. In Wichita, again, we just did not have those numbers. But one similarity between Chicago and Wichita was, again, the diversity of enterprises that existed. In Wichita, obviously, we're talking about smaller enterprises linked with a smaller population. But again, we see and continue to see, African Americans engage in a wide variety of enterprises above and beyond sort of the traditional businesses that we talked about earlier. But the main difference, again, is population. And again, keeping in mind that even in Chicago, which is, a northern state, if you will, Chicago had, in fact, experienced racial segregation. But again, in that setting, African Americans were able to, sustain larger businesses, whereas here in Wichita, that was not the case.
Okay, one final question. Are there, in speaking with the Black leaders that you interviewed in your oral histories, obviously there's a high bar to success in business under any circumstances, but why do you have a sense through your interviews why these particular individuals were successful? Were they exceptional anyway? What kind of characteristics, distinguish the success of one business from those many others who don't make it?
Great question. And I think that's something that literally transcends race. When we look at entrepreneurs, they're not like most people. Most people are sort of content to, work for someone else. Entrepreneurs tend to have a strong independent streak that compels them to do something above and beyond the ordinary. The people that I spoke to here, there's, high levels of perseverance and endurance, because when we talk about, small business in general, upwards of 90 to 95% of small businesses, Black, white, or what have you, fail within the first 5 years. So the odds are not in entrepreneurs' favor in terms of success. So you have to have this sort of audacious belief in yourself in order to even think that you're going to be in that 5% that ultimately is going to succeed. Another important dynamic were role models. A lot of the individuals that I spoke with, and I asked a lot of these individuals specifically, who were your role models, or did you have role models? The vast majority of them, did have role models. Some had somebody in the immediate family, somebody had, uncles, cousins, or what have you, and others just had business people that they observed in the community. But then again, sort of the prototype in this was Xavier Hightower, whose mother, had been a successful, entrepreneur. And again, Xavier Hightower, from an early age, was obviously influenced by her mother's example and sought to emulate it. So I would just say, again, to sum up, an audacious belief in yourself and having access to role models.
Thank you so much, Dr. Weems, for sharing your time and your expertise with us this afternoon. It was a fascinating and so interesting discussion. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's been my pleasure.
To our virtual audience, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We're so glad you could be with us. You'll want to tune in again in a couple of weeks. Mark your calendars for Tuesday, May 11th in the afternoon at 3 p.m. We'll be welcoming former retired U.S. Senator from Kansas, Senator Pat Roberts, will be making an appearance on the Digital Dole Institute. This is the first time we've been able to catch up with him since his retirement earlier this year, and in conjunction again with our exhibit Voices from the Big First. Senator Roberts began his career as an assistant to U.S. Senator from Kansas, Frank Carlson, in the late 1960s, and had a connection with Congressman Dole in the 1960s. He was a staff assistant to Congressman Keith Sebelius in the 1970s, and then went on to represent the Big First himself in the House of Representatives in 1980 until he was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1996. So he has a long personal history with Kansas and the Big First, and we'll be so excited to hear his perspective on his service and also on his retirement as well. I will reissue my invitation to you all to come to the Dole Institute sometime during our open hours, Thursday through Sunday. Check out our hours online and come see our fantastic current exhibit, Voices from the Big First. Thanks again for your time this afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you here at the Institute and also online on the Digital Dole Institute. Take care, everyone.
Thank you for joining the Dole Institute of Politics for our program this afternoon. If you are a student and would like to join the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu. In a few weeks, on May 5th, we look forward to hosting Ambassador of Belgium to the United States, Jean-Arthur Regibaud, for the 2021 Dole Lecture. You can access this program on the Dole Institute's YouTube channel, just like this afternoon's program. Refer to doleinstitute.org for up-to-date information on all of our upcoming programs. We hope you enjoyed this afternoon's program. Thank you, and we will virtually see you next time.